We've now got a pretty good idea of how to work with JSX, so now we're going to move on to our next topic, which is dealing with lists. Showing lists of elements inside of a mobile application is super fundamental, so we're going to spend a decent amount of time on it to make sure we really understand what's going on. To get started, I'm going to first create a new component inside of my screens directory. So inside of here, I'll make a new file called listscreen.js. Then inside of here, we're going to write out a little bit of boilerplate to create a React component. So I'm going to write out import React. From React, I'll import view, text, and style sheet from React Native. I'll then create my list screen component. And for right now, I'll return a text element that just says list screen. I'll then create my style sheet. So I'll say const styles is styles sheet.create and put in an empty object for right now, and then export default list screen. Okay, so this boilerplate right here, you might even want to copy paste off and keep around because we're going to write it out many times throughout this course. So now if we just save this file, once again, we're not going to see any change on the screen of our device. To actually get this thing to show up, remember, we have to import it into our app.js file and wire it up to that navigator. So I'm going to change back to the app.js file inside of my root project directory. At the top, I will import the list screen from source screens list screen, and then we will wire it up to our navigator right here. So I will say list is list screen. And then finally, I want to show that screen by default when our application first starts up. So I'm going to change components right here to list instead. Now, eventually, we're going to add in some ability for our users of this little application we're putting together to change between all these different screens. But for right now, we're just going to stick with this kind of strategy of using the initial route name to show different components. So eventually, we'll fix this up, but for right now, this is working out just fine. Okay, so I'm going to now check out my device, and yep, there we go. I've got my list screen. So now that we've got something to add some code to, let's take a quick pause and then talk about how we build lists in the next video. We've now got a component put together that we can use to experiment with the lists on. So let's get a better idea of how we build a list with React. Okay, so here's the general idea. We're always going to start off with some array of records that we're going to want to represent on the screen in some fashion. So this might be an array of objects, where each object has maybe a name property. So maybe every object inside of here represents a friend or something like that. We could also have an array of numbers, or an array of strings, or an array of absolutely anything. But in general, when we are building out a list with React Native, our starting point is an array that we want to build out into a series of different React components and show to the user. In order to take an array like this and turn it into a series of React components, we're going to use another one of those primitive elements from React Native. The primitive element we're going to use is called the flat list. So we're going to use the flat list primitive element to take an array of records and turn it into some list to display on the screen of our device. When we make use of the flat list element, we are always going to pass in two different props. Remember, props are configuration options we specify when we write out a JSX element. The first required prop is called data. So we have to pass in an array of records that we want to turn into a collection of React elements to show on the screen. Now, flat list doesn't technically just figure out for us how to display each of these different elements. Instead, it's up to you and me to provide a function called the render item prop that's going to be called with every individual element out of that array, and it's going to be up to you and me to return from that function a little bit of JSX that describes how we want to show each element on the screen. We'll see how to write that out in just a moment, because when I use words to describe that, it's a little bit confusing. Now, the last thing I want to mention really quickly is that if you're coming from the world of React.js from the web, you might be used to mapping over an array of data to build out a list. So in the React Native world, rather than doing that, we use the flat list element instead. And the reason for that is that the flat list has a bunch of optimizations built into it to render a huge list of elements on a mobile device in a very performant fashion. And we'll describe how that optimization works in just a little bit. Okay, so now that we've introduced the flat list element, we'll take a quick pause and then come back to our list screen in the next video and get a better idea of. In this video, we're going to write out a quick example using the flat list component. So inside of listscreen.js, I'm going to first import flat list at the very top like so. Then inside of my list screen component, I'm going to build up some array of objects that I want to eventually render onto the screen of my device. So I'm going to create an array inside of here called friends. And I'm going to have that be an array of objects. Every object is going to have a name property, and I'll just give it a name of like friend number 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and so on. So I'm just going to copy that object down a couple times. And I'll go through and manually change each of these numbers. So friend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So this is the array of records that we want to turn into a list. To do so, we're going to remove the text element that we have right here, and I'll replace it with a flat list. When we place a flat list, as I mentioned, there are 2 required props. The first required prop that we discussed is the data prop. So we have to pass in the array of records that we want to turn into our list. So I'll define flat list right here, and I'll define the data prop and pass in the friends array that I just created right here. The second required prop is called render item. So I'm going to add in render item to my flat list as well. And this is supposed to be a function that is going to be called with every element out of our array. Now, if I start to add in some more implementation for this function right here, this line is going to get really hard to read really quickly. So I might try to multi-line this JSX expression right here. To do so, I'll place a set of parentheses around flat list. And now right in front of each of these different props, I'll put in a new line character. So now it's just a little bit easier to read than what we had before. Okay, so as I was saying, this render item right here is going to be called with each individual element. Now this element argument right here is a little bit misleading. You might think that this element argument is like going to be exactly this object right here. Unfortunately, it's not. The element argument actually has a couple of different properties in it. So if we were to console log this thing out, element would be like this. It would have an item property that was our friend object. So that's where our name with like friend of number 1 would come from. And then it also has an index property as well. So unfortunately, element is not just the friend object. Instead, it's this rather large object that describes a lot of information about the element that we are trying to render into a JSX thing. So usually, rather than receiving this entire argument right here, we instead usually just pull off the item property, which is the actual object that we have inside of our array up here. To just pull off that item property, we'll usually make use of ES2015 destructuring. So rather than writing out the full word element, we could place a set of curly braces inside those parens, and then just write out item. So that means we're going to get a direct reference to this item property, which effectively will be our friend object that has a name inside of it. So now if we did a console log of item by itself, it would be just name with like friend number 1, or whichever friend it is. Okay, so usually whenever we build out a list like this, we're just going to destructure off that item property. So now inside of this function, we have to return some amount of JSX that's going to describe how we want to show this item right here on the screen, or this friend as it were. So in this case, we might just try to show some little bit of text. Then inside that text, we can make use of those curly braces to print up a JavaScript variable inside there. So remember, item is going to essentially be this object, then this object, then this object, and so on. So if we want to just print up the name, we would reference inside those curly braces item.name. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so now this right here is going to show a list on our screen. However, it's also going to result in a warning message. We're going to save this right here and test it out. I just want you to know that we are going to see a warning message. We'll discuss exactly what it means in just a moment and then fix it up. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'll flip back over, and there's my list right there. Now, if you try to scroll through this, you're going to notice that it actually has some scrolling functionality. So I can kind of scroll through my list of elements right away. And if you're on Android, you'll see something like that, and the list on Android is not going to be scrollable. On iOS, lists are usually kind of bouncy scroll like this, but on Android, that's not the case. So if you are on Android and you can't scroll the list at all, that's totally fine. Okay, so clearly we can now show a list of elements on the screen, but as I mentioned, we've got a warning down here. So the warning says virtualized list, missing keys for items. So let's have a quick pause right here, and we'll discuss exactly what this warning message is talking about in the next video. We'll also kind of do a discussion around the flat list component in general and understand better what it's really doing behind the scenes.